The time of the Soviet Union was not just about scarcity, chess tournaments, and general secretaries. In the past, there were many brutal, sophisticated murders, the stories of which are still horrifying. Nutcases with axes, school teachers, murderers, and misgas workers are all criminals made famous by their heinous murders. In this issue, you will learn about the maniacs who kept the entire Soviet Union in fear. The name Chikatilo has long been a nickname for all maniacs. And indeed, he is the most monstrous criminal in the history of the Soviet Union. It is hard to believe, but this man led the most inconspicuous life of a Soviet citizen, was married, and had 2 children. People who knew Andrei Chikatilo spoke of him as a modest man and called him an exemplary family man. No one could even assume that he was the very same brutal maniac who was hunted by law enforcement agencies for so long. Chikatilo's childhood was difficult and full of decisions, which, according to psychiatrists, simply couldn't help but affect his psyche. The events of World War II also had to do with my growing up, the bombings, poverty, and constant anxiety. Chikatilo was a withdrawn child with problems of socialization and communication. He had almost no friends at school and experienced constant humiliation from his peers. Endless beatings, mockery, and failures nurtured in Chikatilo a sense of incredible aggression toward the world and a desire to prove his strength by any means necessary. Such a way was found in adulthood. According to criminalists, Andrei Chikatilo always met with his victims at train stations and offered various kinds of assistance, such as carrying a bag or showing the way. Such an attitude immediately disposes to him, an intelligent man of age with a calm face, neatly dressed, and all the more so that the acquaintance was established in a crowded place. What could happen? The calculation, however, was just that. A relaxed conversation went on, and while the victim did not suspect anything, Chikatilo showed a shortcut, lured them to deserted places, then suddenly attacked the unfortunates and killed them with extreme cruelty. It was this man's desperate cruelty and utter lack of transparency that brought him such notoriety. The bodies of murdered people were found with several dozen stab wounds, and many of them were mutilated beyond recognition. In addition, Chikatilo was incredibly industrious. Every year more and more people died at his hands. His neatness, his ability to cover his tracks and remain inconspicuous made the search very difficult. It was impossible to catch Chikatilo for 10 whole years. It seemed that this man was simply devilishly elusive. However, in 1984, at one of the train stations, it was completely by accident stopped by a police patrol. It was a routine check. The officers of the law decided to look through his belongings, and what they found there alarmed them. There was a knife and a rope in the suitcase. Indeed, why would a passenger need such a kit? And it is with this scene that the new Chikatilo series begins. It is a very realistic, meticulous reconstruction of the investigation of the terrible crimes of Andrei Chikatilo, which, by the way, inspired me to make this video. And here's what happened next. He was taken to the police station, where Chikatilo calmly and very intelligently explained the presence of these things in his possession. He covered with his job as a procurer, which he had taken a job a few months earlier. Chikatilo said that the rope was used to tie up unstable boxes, and that the knife was used to cut off the excess end of this very rope. The good thing for him was that his blood type was different from the semen found on the bodies of the victims. And such people are one in a few million. And his image as a model family man, husband, and communist father played into his hands. He spoke so convincingly that they simply let him go on to build his career as a supply officer. But apparently the situation frightened the maniac. After this incident, he stopped his activities for 2 years and even moved to another city. But, as practice shows, there are no X's in such business. Chikatilo continued killing. More than 20 more people died at his hands. Already under interrogation, Chikatilo claimed that the agony and human fear gave him an incredible pleasure. He reveled in these feelings and craved them again and again. He could not replace it with anything in ordinary life, so he simply could not stop. In order to catch Chikatilo, a whole special operation was planned in the USSR. They managed to arrest him only in 1990. For 10 years, this man held the whole country in fear and acted with absolute impunity. The maniac had 53 murders to his credit. Some of the victims were even unknown to the investigator. Their bodies were found only after the perpetrator's personal instructions. After a psychiatric examination, former schoolteacher Andrei Chikatilo was found sane and sentenced to death. One of the very first serial killers in the history of the Soviet Union, whose crimes received extremely wide publicity, was Vladimir Ionishin. He was popularly known by the nickname Misgaz. Ionishin would get into the homes of his victims under the guise of a Misgaz worker. Such a cover was ideal because at the time gullible Soviet people could not even assume that they were opening the door not to an employee who came to them to check the gas stove, but to a serial maniac. Once inside the apartment, the criminal would pull out the axe he had brought with him under his jacket and kill all the residents with ferocious cruelty. Misgaz committed his first murder in 1963 and only for the money. The temptation was very great. The door of the apartment he called was opened by a 12-year-old boy. Convinced that the child was home all alone, Ionishin cut him up with an axe and then took all his valuables and money. Such quick and sudden wealth pleased Misgaz very much. From that moment on, he began to actively plunder. His method was always the same. Apparently, the criminal was confident of his complete impunity. In any case, he decided on his next murder 5 days later. Misgaz chose only those apartments where no one could oppose him. Lonely pensioners or a child were the most ideal situation for him. The breaks between his crimes rarely reached a week. One day he tried so hard that he killed 2 people at once in one day. It's worth noting that the killer didn't try very hard to hide his tracks, and it was a fluke that helped him stay free for a long time. At that time in the Soviet Union, the police departments were actively reduced and even disbanded. There was a huge shortage of operatives and even just policemen, and there was no one to investigate. Feeling completely elusive, Misgaz became quite impudent. During his next case, the burglar took a huge TV set out of the apartment. Who knows what his greed would have gotten him, and would he have taken out a gas stove or a cast iron bathtub? But it was this case that was fatal for the criminal. The residents of the house saw a stranger coming out of the entranceway, and with something large wrapped in a sheet. His car was recorded and turned over to the police. A few days later, Vladimir Ionishin was detained. The court sentenced him to death. This case was widely discussed in the press. When the public learned that Misgaz had been detained, bags of letters from the citizens of the USSR began arriving at the court, asking for even harsher punishment. People asked that the sentence be carried out not somewhere, but on Red Square in front of a crowd of people. Of course, they did not fulfill this request. Gennady Mikasevich was born in 1947 in the village of East, Belarusian SSR. His family was poor and troubled. His father drank heavily, abused his son, and often beat him. Mikasevich was used to cruel treatment and grew up a reserved and secretive child. In his youth, he fell in love with a fellow villager, with whom he later tried to build a serious relationship. It did not come to marriage, however, and Mikasevich was drafted into the army, while his beloved Elena did not wait for her lover and married another man. According to psychiatrists, it was this deception of a loved one, who for the only time in his life wanted to confide in Mikasevich, that finally disappointed him in life. Upon his return from the army, he left his native village and enrolled in a city technical school. A few years later, he decided to visit his parents. On the road, Mikasevich, according to his own accounts, thought long and hard about his existence and decided he didn't want to live anymore. He made a rope from his belongings and was about to hang himself from a nearby tree, but in the distance he saw a pedestrian. It was a young, attractive girl. Mikasevich suddenly changed his mind about dying, attacked the unfortunate woman, and strangled her. And the feelings he experienced during the murder pleased him so much that Mikasevich began to kill further with erasure. After a while, Mikasevich finished his studies, returned to his native village to his permanent place of residence. It is possible that the feelings of his homeland had a special effect on the criminal, because he killed his next victim right at the train station, as they say, without leaving the ticket office. Then, to all appearances, he was still afraid that a crime in such a small village would not go unpunished, and for 2 years he stopped killing. He continued to live in his home village and went to the nearest settlements to hunt. But in 1976, Mikasewicz's affairs suddenly improved. He got a good job, got married, and moved to another village. He still did not stop killing, however. During this socially successful year, 4 more girls died at his hands. Rumors of a mysterious maniac spread through the village. None of the neighbors, however, could assume that it would be Gennady Mikasevich, because everyone considered him a model family man, and he was well respected at work. Moreover, Mikasevich personally organized a team to catch himself and began to actively communicate with the police about how best to organize the capture. To further confuse the investigation, he anonymously sent a note to the editor-in-chief of the local newspaper informing that all the murdered victims were the work of the anti-Soviet organization Patriots of Vitebsk. 2 months later, Mikasevich committed another murder, and in the mouth of his last victim he put a note death to communists and their henchmen, which was signed by the same non-existent anti-Soviet organization Patriots of Vitebsk. As a result of the expertise, it turned out that the letter to the newspaper and the note were written by the same person. Then they decided to find the maniac by his handwriting. Graphologists checked more than 500,000 handwritings of almost all adults in the area where the crimes took place, and after a month of investigation, Mikasevich was found out. A search of his possessions revealed some of his victims' personal belongings, which were recognized by their relatives. At the trial, Mikasevich behaved perfectly calm, but when it came to his first love, Elena, he burst into tears. In 1987, Gennady Mikhailovich was shot. If you liked the video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and write what you think about it. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Your support is very important to me.